Hey, welcome back. My name is Jeff. If you're new here, welcome to my Cave of Cool Books. If you've been here before, thank you and welcome back. Apologies right away for the state of my voice. I'm kind of getting over, I don't think it's a cold, it's some kind of weird allergy / cold thing that's kind of buggered my voice a little bit. But today I want to do a wrap-up video for what I read during the month of March. March was a really busy and productive month for me. I was on vacation throughout, and so I did lots of collaborations with people. I did several live streams, several regular videos, some of which I'll refer to here. If I talked about a particular book that I read in more detail in one of those, I will refer you back to that and also have those videos in the description down below. But let's go with the novels first. If I count strictly by titles of novels, I read 11 novels, but the first book I read had 3 novels in it. So back in the second week of March, I talked to John at the Robert E. Howard Foundation and Jim at Mystery and Mayhem, and we talked about Doc Savage, and we talked about several Doc Savage novels and the character and the writers and the production of the original pulps, etc. And as a consequence of that, or before that, I read my one of these Nostalgia Ventures editions, and you'll see the Nostalgia Ventures little logo here. A man named Anthony Tolan put these out with a lot of help from pulp and Doc Savage expert Will Murray, who did lots of introductions to various pieces, and all of these had at least 2 novels, and in some cases, if the novels were shorter from late in the Doc Savage pulp run, 3 inside one of these editions. Now these are pulp size, kind of like a pulp replica, although not exactly, because they combine several novels, and you'll see double column pages. So quite a lot of text put in here, but we also have, some art from the pulps and art done for various, some of the art was done at various different times. I don't know if this was done in the original pulp or not. I can't quite recall, but it's interesting anyway. And of course, some information about here's an original pulp illustration, pretty cool. And some information on, the various editors for the magazine and writers, and let's see, for example, Mr. Lester Dent, the original or the person who kind of put flesh on the bones of Doc Savage the character and wrote the lion's share of the novels, and he wrote all 3 of these. So we have Terror Wears No Shoes, The Red Spider, and Return from Cormoral, or Cormoral, I'm not sure how you want to pronounce that. And I read all 3 of those. These are all from the years 1948 and 1949. So the final years of the Doc Savage magazine, when they were only having a few issues coming out in a year rather than the 10 to 12 issues that were the norm back in the early days of the Doc Savage pulp magazine. Anyway, The Red Spider is a very cool one. It's the one that of these 3 that did get its own individual novel, Bantam paperback, produced in 1977. It had never been published in the original pulp run. It was turned down by the editor at the time. We talk about that more in the video I'll link to below, the conversation about Doc Savage. But it's a very good kind of proto-Bondian sort of behind the Iron Curtain spy yarn. It's quite fun. And the other 2 are good too. The Terror Wears No Shoes, kind of a weird title, but it's about Doc and again Ham and Monk, his 2 most frequently appearing aides out of his 5 aides that helped him throughout the many adventures that he had. Doc Savage is in, I believe, Singapore, Hong Kong maybe, and he's trying to prevent some biological warfare from falling into evil hands. And Return from Cormoral is kind of an interesting one about a guy who's been convinced over kind of a very laborious process that he can kind of predict the future. And he contacts Doc Savage saying, "What's up with this? I don't like it." And some of his colleagues have some nefarious plans for his wealthy estate, and Doc gets involved and they end up in the Arctic and have some adventures up there. These are much more down-to-earth kind of Doc Savage novels, not the sprawling, wild, genius, evil mastermind with a nefarious, world-spanning death machine sort of plots that were the norm in the early Doc Savage super sagas. These are much more of a human-scale Doc who shows more emotion, who shows more vulnerability, but they're still well-written and very enjoyable. They're all probably roughly 27, 28, 29,000 words, so they'd probably be classed as novellas these days, but they were 3 individual pulp novel titles, so I'll count them as 3 books, really, but they were all collected in this one edition. So I enjoyed these quite a bit, and I wish I had more of these Nostalgia Ventures editions. There's some of the original pulp titles there for Terror Wears No Shoes and Return from Cormoral. Now, since the Red Spider never got a pulp cover because it wasn't released in the pulps, it got a typical cool Bantam paperback cover. This is the cover that would have appeared on the Bantam paperback edition that came out in 1977. Bob Larkin did this cover, and it's pretty badass. So for a lot of more talk about Doc Savage and pulps in general, please refer to that great conversation and collaboration video I did with John and Jim. Okay, after that, I read another collaboration, another buddy read I read with Eric from the Paperback Warrior, Fair Blows the Wind by Louis L'Amour. This is a really fun, sprawling, coming-of-age, swashbuckling, historical adventure yarn. Something a little different from what Louis L'Amour usually produced. It wasn't a Western, although, parts of it took place in America, the kind of framing story. But most of it is told from the point of view of the central character, and who goes by the name of Tatton Chantry. And he talks about, all that happened to him in his native Ireland and Scotland and England, etc., his adventures there, and in the continent, in Spain, and I believe partly in France. And he, in the large middle section of the book is taken up with that. And then it's kind of bookended by his being kind of shipwrecked or stranded on the North Carolina coast, or what would have been known as the Carolinas maybe at that time, back in the maybe late 1600s. Anyway, that was a very fun read and a very good and fun conversation with Eric. And I refer you to that detailed conversation also, which I'll link to below for more details about my thoughts on, and Eric's thoughts on that book. After that, I read a couple of Westerns. One of them was kind of just to tie into the March on the Rails BookTube event that took place last month. And that was a really fun event, and I took part in that with a couple of reads. This one was another in the Big Jim Western adventure series from writer Leonard B. Mears, writing under the name Marshall Grover, published in the States. I don't believe this one was, but some of his Big Jim books were published as Nevada Jim under the name of Marshall McCoy. And this, previous month I had reviewed the first Big Jim adventure, and this is continuing in the same vein, very fun, maybe not quite as fun as Leonard B. Mears' Larry and Stretch series entries, but good fun, especially because Big Jim, who's a big, as he sounds, big, strapping, typical kind of badass loner, resourceful hero of Western fiction, he is saddled with a kind of I guess you could say, bantering companion who is really fun. Benito, I believe his name is Benito. Yeah, and he's, tagging along with Jim. They've saved each other's lives, so they kind of feel a little beholden to each other. And they get involved in this one partly with a train robbery, or an attempted train robbery. And the robbery does come off. Basically, the plan is for a bunch of kind of local seedy ranchers who've decided to come up with this plan to waylay this train that's full of wealthy Mexican families who are going to this town called Moredo, down near the border between Texas and and Mexico to have a big festival. And they're loaded up with their finery. The ladies they're all wealthy Mexicans, so they have lots of jewelry and pearl-handed guns and money, etc., diamond rings. And so these guys decide they're going to hold up the train. But it happens that Big Jim, in his search for the man who killed his brother, shot him in the back. And this man is one of the members of this gang, as it turns out. Big Jim is heading to Moredo for the same purpose, to try to track this guy down, and he's on board with Benito and one of the daughters of this Mexican group of wealthy Mexicans, who doesn't want to marry her arranged marriage future partner, who's kind of a dumb hick farmer, big unattractive guy that she doesn't want to get involved with. And so Jim dresses her up as a boy, and him and Benito take this woman they're kind of in a mutual have to help each other sort of situation. And while they're traveling to Moredo on the train, also back in one of the kind of cattle cars or horse cars, because Big Jim doesn't want to be separated from his horse. Anyway, this train robbery goes off. Jim kills several of them, but gets wounded in the process, and then eventually goes on the hunt for the rest of these guys and serves out some justice. Very fun, action-packed, swift, short Western novel. Mears can really, plot out a fun and lively Western adventure. And because there was a big chunk of it set on a train, I thought it was a good match for the March on the Rails BookTube event. Now, I read another one that also happened. I didn't read it because of March on the Rails, but it happened to fit just fine on it. This was Showdown at Guyamas. This is book 1, I guess, in the Spectros series of some Westerns that were written. The Big Jim novel was written in the 60s. This one was written in the late 70s or early, I think it's 78, 79, something like that. And this was by a writer named Paul Lederer. He was seems to be a prolific Western writer. Now, this came out kind of in the period of, a lot of men's adventure fiction and, more adult Westerns, so-called adult because there's a lot of sex in them and, lots of sleaze and such. And there's none of that in this book, really. But it's pretty interesting. I did this as part of a buddy read with Sam at Captain's Samuel's Sigils. And he approached me with the idea of doing this series because it's kind of got a supernatural side to it, which appealed to Sam, who had never read a Western before. The supernatural aspects are a little slight, but the basic idea is Dr. Spectros is this guy that maybe is hundreds of years old. We're not quite sure. He's an old man traveling around in the back of this wagon with 3 companions, a gunfighter named Ray Featherskill, a big kind of mountain man mute named Montauk, and Inkada, this, I don't know if he's a Sikh or a Hindi or a Moor of some kind, who carries a big kris, kind of big curved knife. And for whatever reason, don't really get the full backstory other than in Montauk's case, but these 3 are highly loyal, beholden to Doc Spectros, and are assisting him in trying to track down this evil wizard called Black Schuster, who has, I guess it's implied years or before, decades, maybe even 100 or more years before, when Doc Spectros was in India rendering some service to an Indian Raja. He married the Raja's daughter, a beautiful daughter. They fell in love and they got married, but on the day of their marriage, she was kidnapped and whisked away by this Black Schuster, who keeps her in a state of suspended animation, and to do so where she's perfectly preserved and alive, but, not awake, not conscious. He has to come up, Black Schuster has to come up with more sources of silver. So Doc has been chasing him around the world, Doc Spectros, to get his bride back, Christina. And this book, they've come to this town that has a silver mine, and there's a bunch of shenanigans going on with some bad guys that, in a typical series fashion, that as Doc Spectros and his crew are almost catching up to Black Schuster, they get involved in some adventure at that particular area and come to some people's aid and maybe just almost get to Black Schuster, but not quite. And then the chase goes on to the next novel. But this one has just enough supernatural elements to kind of engage the interest, but they don't make as much of them as you would maybe like. Doc Spectros has a couple of skills. He can turn into animals. He turns into, a hawk, or he can turn into a wildcat or something like that. But his main piece of magic that really tires him out and he renders him kind of weak for weeks and perhaps months at a time is he can change himself when needed into a sleeker, younger version of himself who's a super badass gunfighter called Kid Soledad. And Kid Soledad makes an appearance in every book. In this one, they're coming to the aid of a lady rancher who some bad guys want her land, and they've hired some really fast guns, and there's lots of back and forth battles and a little bit of a hint of romance between Ray Featherskill and this young lady. And, lots of action. It's quite a traditional and, well done Western, pretty well written, some good description in there. But the scuttlebutt of what I've seen online in reference to this series, and there were, I believe, 5 books in this series. I know of at least 4 that were published in paperback form in the 70s and early 80s. The main complaint was there wasn't enough wasn't made of those supernatural elements. One of the later books involves werewolves, another one involves kind of a marauding Bigfoot creature, and apparently that aspect of it is kind of not really played up as much as we might like, being fans of weird fiction. But if you're a fan of Western fiction, this one's pretty damn good, and I enjoyed it. After that, I actually have a physical book to show you now. I have I went back and forth between books that are hard for me to find here in Japan that I could find easily in ebook form. And then I have some that I could actually get my hands on, and that was this one. DC's The New Frontier by Darwyn Cooke, who did the art and the story. And the other person credited, Dave Stewart, was, I believe, the colorist on this. And this is a pretty epic tale, kind of about Silver Age. What if the DC Silver Age heroes were put into the framework of real historical events, like, World War II, the Red Scare, the, Civil Rights Movement, things like that. And I reviewed this one and talked about it during a live stream with David at Garage Geek. And I'll link that discussion below as well. This was a really fun and interesting read. It was a little confusing for me, who's not so up on my Silver Age comic book lore from DC. This version is the DC Compact Comics line, and it doesn't have, it does a nice job reproducing, the art and the kind of cool comic booky retro style that Darwyn Cooke uses. With this island, kind of living island full of all sorts of beasties, etc., that the various heroes are fighting. And it has all of that stuff. Everything from the story is complete, but in the other larger versions, there are some notes from the author who kind of talks about the various Easter eggs he layered in there. And luckily, David had that version, and he kindly shared me some photos of those footnotes, which helped kind of explain some things I didn't get. The main point is, if you don't really know much about it, it's okay. You just kind of follow through, and everything does eventually come together. But I felt it was a little fragmented of an approach, but it does pull together with some good kind of focus at the very end and gets pretty exciting. It does include Golden Age heroes like Wonder Woman, Superman, Batman. They have crucial roles here, but this is mostly about the coming of into 4 of the Silver Age heroes. So we have Hal Jordan's Green Lantern and Barry Allen's The Flash, and we have a whole bunch of other characters that I'm not that familiar with. We have Martian Manhunter and the Challengers of the Unknown and all that stuff. So it was pretty cool. I enjoyed it quite a bit, and I enjoyed the conversation with David. And we're going to continue talking about more of these kind of noted comics runs that DC Compact Comics line has been putting out, including, I think next up we're going to talk about Kingdom Come. which looks quite interesting. So I'm in the middle of, I've just kind of recently started that one. So that one's in the works for hopefully this next month. Next, I read partially in book form, but mostly in audiobook form, One Summer, America, 1927 by Bill Bryson. Now, this is nonfiction. Some of you might know Bill Bryson. He wrote A Walk in the Woods about hiking the Appalachian Trail with a old school friend. That's a very funny book. It was turned into a movie with Robert Redford. But, you know, he wrote a very funny book about Australia called In a Sunburned Country. He's written a lot of best-selling nonfiction books. This one is really good, and he narrates, or he reads the audiobook version, which I already had on my Audible app on my phone, and I just decided, you know, with the way timing was working out, that I would mostly listen to it. And I did read probably about 1/6 of it in physical book form, and then sometimes check in as I go to, you know, mark my progress along with the audiobook, but mostly it was listened to by audiobook, via audiobook. And this is a really good book. Bryson maybe doesn't do a lot of primary research, but what he's really good at is taking a whole bunch of research that's already been done about a particular subject or period and putting it into a kind of easily digestible and well-written and pithy and interesting and kind of macro look style that really puts everything into perspective, and he does a very good job at that. And this, you know, really showcases what this time period, how many weird and wild things happened during this time period. Now, two of the biggest kind of through lines of this book are Babe Ruth and Charles Lindbergh, two really famous historical figures. And he talks a lot about the early days of baseball, and about, you know, a lot of this book especially starts off talking about, you know, flight and how America was really behind Europe at this time as far as, you know, any sort of aircraft, or no commercial aircraft other than airmail delivery and barnstormers and things. And a lot of World War I aces were kind of left with not much to do after the war. But here, you know, this was the time when America finally was trying to push forward with that particular industry, and how instrumental Charles Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic was for that, and just how amazingly skilled of a flyer Lindbergh was. They make it really clear, you know, the Spirit of St. Louis, the plane, he couldn't see straight ahead. He had to bank over to see where he was going. He went through some terrible weather. He hardly ate anything for 36 hours or however long it took him to cross. Landed exactly where he was supposed to in France. Just an amazing pilot, perhaps one of the best ever seen in history. But he, you know, he was a flawed man, and Bryson goes on to talk about his, you know, kind of victory tour that was so exhausting and hard on him, and the subsequent turn his life took later towards fascism. It's quite an interesting part of the book, but that's only one tiny sliver. Talks about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig duking it out for the home run record of historical home run record during this summer. Talks about you know, just everything you can possibly think of. Henry Ford, the starting of the design of Mount Rushmore. This was when the first talkie films came in. The Jazz Singer came out then. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was started then, and the film Wings that was released in 1927, starring Clara Bow and directed by William Wellman. That was the first Academy Award-winning film the following year, or 1929, whenever they started the actual Oscars. But this was, you know, the coming of sound into film, and, you know, Al Capone, and the first big school bombing in the United States in Michigan, and, you know, the architecture for the Great Depression coming soon, waiting in the wings, the rise of Herbert Hoover, and kind of how President Calvin Coolidge did very little during this time. I mean, dozens and dozens of historical figures, Sacho and Vicente, the rise of anarchists, the rise of eugenics, and, quite shocking that it started with various scientists and researchers in America before it was spreading throughout Europe. I mean, just a lot of craziness. And it was an amazing year of stuff that happened, both good and bad. And it's really well put together in this book. Now, it's 600 pages long, exactly, for the story itself, including the epilogue. And it's divided into months. It starts with a kind of prologue, and then it goes to May, June, July, August, includes September. So I guess we'll give it the Indian summer. And then there's an epilogue kind of tracing the eventual fates and timelines of many of the main cast of real life characters in this book. And then, a whole bunch of footnotes and sources, bibliography, etc. So, big fat book, but well worth reading. I took my time with it. I started it in, the end of February and finished it sometime about 2/3 away through March. Very good. I mentioned before the March on the Rails BookTube event. The one I read particularly for that event was one of the British Library Crime Classics anthologies edited by Martin Edwards of classic detective and mystery and crime stories. This one was called Blood on the Tracks, Railway Mysteries. It was published in 2018. I read it on the Kindle. I have most of these Martin Edwards edited anthologies via the Kindle because they are so dirt cheap. $2.98, $3, $2.50, $1.98. It's hard to pass up the price. They're not that expensive in actual trade paperback form either, but I can have many more for less price, and that's how I have most of them. And this one was really good. Lots of good variety of authors and stories, all related to subways, trains, rail lines, railway engineers. And a lot of them are featuring classic detectives from basically from the Victorian era on up into the 50s or early 60s, perhaps, for the last story in the book. A lot of well-known authors if you're a fan of mysteries. I reviewed that book at length fairly recently on my channel, so I'll link to that video below as well. Please go there to get more detail on that collection or that anthology. And two more I read, not really to tie into, middle grade March, but I did want to read another kind of juvenile fiction from my collection since I did a video on that a while back. And for the first time, I'm familiar with the TV series, but I've never read the books. I've, looked at them and familiar with some of the illustrations and such, but I read the first of the Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is Little House in the Big Woods. This was published originally in 1932, based on Laura Ingalls Wilder's, not exact autobiography, but with a lot of autobiographical details of her life growing up on the frontier. I believe this one's set in the woods of Wisconsin, and it's got these beautiful, Garth Williams illustrations, very characteristic illustrations. And even though it's told from the perspective of Laura herself and growing up, and you'll see the print is quite large in this particular Dell Yearling edition. This is a Harper Trophy, not a Dell. But they're pretty much set up the same way. Anyway, the figure who really emerges out of these books, at least at this stage, is Laura's pa. And he's quite a guy, quite a loving father figure, and very competent. Very dear to his daughters, Laura's sister Mary, and they have the baby Carrie. That's not really heard from much in the book, but this is a very nicely written reminiscence. No real plot to speak of, more of just kind of a whole year in the seasonal life of this family and their various relatives and occasional other friends and visitors. And Pa and Ma, of course, and Laura and Mary and Carrie all live in this little house, this cabin in the big woods. And all the animals they encounter and all that what they do to survive the cold winters. And how they prepare their food. It starts off, for vegetarians or vegans or animal lovers out there, some of this part might be difficult to read, but it was a part of life back then, and that is how animals were often hunted and used for food, but they very carefully use everything they possibly can, including the hide, the bones, etc., the fat, and that might be a little bit of a hurdle, but in between, Pa will tell stories of his childhood when he got into some mischief with being chased by bears or getting into trouble. And there's a beautiful scene later in the book where Pa Ingalls comes home without getting late, he went out to hunt and he came home with no meat. And, the family is fine because they know he's a really great provider and they're not worried about it. But he tells the girls secretly that he was sitting in this tree ready to hunt and kill something, and he saw this young buck, and it was so beautiful he just couldn't bring himself to shoot it. And then he saw another bear, and he decided he just didn't want to shoot it either. He was just kind of looking at the stars and just didn't really feel like killing these beautiful animals this particular time. And his daughters, whispered to him, "I'm glad you didn't shoot the bear, Daddy, or shoot the deer, Daddy." And he says, "My sweet little girls," And anyway, he does often, of course, kill lots of meat. They need it, but that was a nice little case where they show that, they also appreciated the animals too. And, they have wonderful celebrations. They get maple syrup out of the trees, having a big dance and lots of food after that, and what they did for Christmas and the harsh winters, and just how simple and focused on day-to-day existence their life was, but how it seemed really full life to them. Laura gets so excited to go and see a store in the town. She had never been to a store in her life. She's, I think, 6 years old in this book, and she's struck dumb. She just can't even imagine this huge settlement of like 20 houses or something, and all the goods in the store and stuff. It's just a magical day for her. It's a really lovely book overall, and I'll read some more of these Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House books. It was a lot of fun, actually, enjoyable read. Finally, as far as novels go, I finished the month reading The Beyonders by Manly Wade Wellman. Now, I've had this paperback for a long time, but I've never read it before. I kind of had a little problem with not a problem, but the main character is Gander-Eye Gentry, and for some reason the name Gander-Eye really bothered me, but I don't think that's his real name. I think that's like a nickname. This has a stamp from Oak Harbor, Washington in it, interestingly. I think I did get this one in Washington State. This is a Warner book, and this came out in 1977, and it is science fiction. This is a science fiction novel, but it's set in the Manly Wade Wellman's Appalachian, Manly Wade Wellman's kind of primo area of expertise in writing, and in the Appalachian Mountains, in a small town, kind of not down on its luck, but kind of run down, not a lot of people there, and that's how some of the inhabitants like it, and some would rather it be a little more lively. A place called Sky Notch, I guess because it's up notched in between these mountains. And this book apparently Wellman was planning to make a series out of it, but the publishers said, "Now this one is enough, and why don't you write some Silver John novels?" So instead he kind of gave up whatever plans he might have had for the characters in this book to continue in more books, and went back to his great and most well-known character, John the Balladeer, and wrote 5 novels featuring him for Doubleday Science Fiction. There is a later Baen Books edition of this, The Beyonders here, that came out, I believe, in the 90s. But this one was originally published, I think this is from the original printing, 1977. And this has cover art by Lou Feck. And I guess this is supposed to be Gander-Eye Gentry here. And this is Slowly Kimber, the beautiful woman that's the main female protagonist in the book. Slowly is her name. I think it comes from Salalo or something. She's got some kind of unusual name, but everyone just says slowly. Anyway, the basic setup, I'll read the back here, and it basically tells the story. But the trouble in Sky Notch all started when that picture painter Crispin, his name's Jim Crispin, came to town. Such a nice fellow, fitted in real well. Doc invited him to dinner. Slowly Kimber square danced with him, and he even got Captain Kimber to let him come watch a clan baptism ritual up in the hills. Gander-eyed Gentry, who had his eye on Slowly, had his eye on Crispin too. Yet even he never linked Crispin with the creature he'd glimpsed in the hills, that thing that left a trail of burnt grass in its wake, and Crispin was an important part of the terror when the most down-to-earth of villages was menaced by something unearthly. So essentially what happens is this Gander-eyed Gentry is a similar character to John the Balladeer, Silver John, in some ways, in that he's a very capable young man, handsome, rugged, manly, lives in the mountains, knows the mountains. He's not quite the wanderer, of course, that John is, and he's a lot more of an edgy character than John. And this book is edgier, I would say, than the average Wellman story. There's a little bit more, not by any means R-rated, but there's a little more risque elements to this story in some parts, a little more nudity and things of that nature. A little more frankness sexually, but it's not by any means, in detail by any stretch. But Gander-eye is cool. He's I guess he's a former military guy, maybe another Korean War veteran like John. It's not said, or maybe Vietnam veteran for all we know. And he just kind of loves the peaceful town of Sky Notch. He likes to hunt and fish and poke around in the woods, and seems to be doing fine without really any credible source of income other than just doing some odd jobs here and there. He's a well-respected member of the community, although he does have a penchant for kind of hardcore practical jokes in some cases, which gets him into trouble a little bit here, because when he starts to see some weird things, these kind of possible creatures or mechanical-looking things that are skulking around the hills. Nobody, even his good friend Doc, retired doctor that lives there and occasionally tends to the sick in that area. Not even Doc, his good friend, believes him. So he spends a lot of the book poking around, trying to investigate what is the connection between this guy, Jim Crispin, this artist who shows up and wants to get to know the Kimber clan. This Kimber clan is odd. They're kind of all described as very almost like Quakerish or something. They have kind of homespun clothing, but they're very proud, very attractive, good-looking people. They keep to themselves. They occasionally come to town for supplies, and they're friendly enough, but they don't like anyone to come onto their land. And they have this kind of weird baptism, which Jim Crispin wants to witness. And he has some kind of strange tie to that family. And what's this Kimber Valley, the Kimber clan's connection to the Beyonders, as they're called? There's a man that keeps harassing Jim Crispin named Struve, who seems to be, implicated with him in some kind of plan for the Beyonders, whoever they are, to move in and take over this town. And Gander-eye is trying to investigate on his own, and is in love with Slowly Kimber, hasn't really ever made a move on her, and what does she think about him? Is she falling for this new arrival in town, this Jim Crispin guy who's a little older but good looking, a very sophisticated type of guy? And everyone likes this Jim Crispin guy, but he is connected to something that's going on and may not be to the benefit of Sky Notch and the people there, or humanity overall. And as we get to the end of the book, for the most of it, it seems like just kind of a novel of Appalachian life with some weird things going on here and there that are hinted at. And then it gets into more of a science fictional sort of rationale towards the end. I enjoyed it a lot. It reads a lot like a Silver John novel. Like I said, a little more earthy and more science fictional based rather than supernatural or supernatural horror, weird fiction based. But there's still enough elements of spookiness and weird fiction to make it fit for fans of Wellman that like his usual stuff. So This is not one of his more well-known novels, but I think it's pretty dang good. So I enjoyed that one a lot. Glad to have finally read it. And to finish up this long, rambling diatribe about what I read this past month, I just read 2 short stories, and those were both in this Black Lizard Big Book of Locked Roomed Mysteries. I did a video about this book, kind of part of my series talking about these various big book anthologies put out by Vintage Crime, Black Lizard, that were edited by Otto Penzler. And I read a couple stories out of that. One of them was by Manly Wade Wellman, and it was called A Knife Between Brothers. And that featured a character called David Return, who's kind of a young chief who's also a tribal policeman who is in charge of, or is put in charge of this case, this kind of first murder case where there are 2 elderly Shisha, I don't know how to pronounce it's a real Indian tribe, but there are 2 elderly brothers that were fighting over some money, and one is found dead with his other brother's knife in his back, but who was the real culprit? That's a fun story. And then I also read a Marjorie Allingham Campion short story called The Borderline Case, which was fun. And I talked about both of these stories in slightly more detail in the video when I went over this, the contents of this book, the Big Book of Locked Room Mysteries. So that's quite a bit. I have a feeling that my subsequent months here in the spring, the rest of the spring, are not going to be quite as fruitful or as busy as far as reading goes. They'll be plenty busy otherwise as my academic year starts back up at my universities where I teach here in Osaka. So you'll probably see a little less of me than you might have recently. Maybe not a bad thing for you guys, but anyway, I'd like to thank everyone who's subscribed, liked, checked out my videos. I really appreciate it. I've just recently started my 2nd year of this channel, and I'm looking forward to what I get up to, what I might get up to for this year, this sophomore year, sophomore season for the channel. And I hope to see it continue to grow and bring some fun stuff to you who are nice enough to come and watch me ramble on. So thanks a bunch. We'll catch you in the next video. Take care and happy reading.